the Book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited them into a covenant relationship. Now they had quickly rebelled and broken the covenant, and God wanted his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle, but Israel's sin had damaged the relationship. So at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, couldn't even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says the Lord called to Moses from the tent. So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about. How God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy simply means to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then, right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual called the Day of Atonement that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that the Israelites could say thank you to God by offering back to God the symbolic tokens of what God had first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So Israelites would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God of course wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones for them, which means it covers their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. Each of these feasts retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. By celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now the sections about Israel's priests. You have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they not only represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much. Back here in the first section, right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. So they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because while it is pure goodness, it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. Therefore, it's important that Israel's priests become holy and also that all the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next sections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves. When they enter into the presence, this is called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who is not in a holy state. And this is called being unclean or impure. Now, Israelites could become impure in just a few ways. by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or touching a dead body. All of these were associated with morality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness, because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life, and impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or two, and then it was over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity with you. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals. The kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that remind Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout the entire land. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every single one of Israel's sins will be covered through the individual sacrifices. So once a year, the high priest will take 2 goats. One of these will become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people, and the other was called the scapegoat. The priest will confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. It's a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant, and he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they are unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline of the Bible, it's helpful to look at its first sentence of the next book, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. Despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.
Hey, these videos are crowdfunded, so we would love your support in reaching our next goal. Your gift of any amount helps make these videos and all the rest of Streetlights resources happen. So join the movement in helping us reach this generation.